We are doing something different this week, which is not reacting to the news of the hour, but actually answering your questions. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, two Jews on the news. As we've been saying, we want to throw it over to you. We've long wanted to do this because we know that the Unholy listener is the smartest listener out there. And we had some last week, some very good questions, and another round equally thought-provoking. Why don't we plunge right in there and kick off with Trudy Chapman, who sends this in from Ottawa in Canada.
Hello, Yonit and Jonathan. Trudy Chapman. Thank you very much for everything that you do. I'm an avid listener from Ottawa, Canada. Not Jewish, but huge supporter of Israel. Lived there in the late 80s. My question has been long and abiding. Has anybody offered Netanyahu clemency from the persecution that people have been after for him? Is that even something that anybody's thought about?
So what I mean, this interests me, Yoni, because this was talked about a fair bit. I feel in the sort of first period of this government, like 2023, the notion of a plea bargain for Prime Minister Netanyahu was talked about. The deal, it was assumed, would be he gets off all the charges and in return he leaves public life. And I remember there was some source saying the thing you've got to know about a plea bargain is it always comes as a surprise. In other words, there'll be no leaks or anything in advance. Well, there hasn't been anything that's come since. It sort of came and went. Is there any talk of that still? Do you hear anything?
Well, first of all, we should say that the talk of a plea bargain was rife even before Netanyahu was reelected. And what happened then was that there were already discussions between the then Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit and Netanyahu's own attorneys. It didn't come to anything because it was the sort of final days of the Attorney General's time in office, and then there were elections, and then Netanyahu was reelected. So that all sort of got sidelined. I think it's important to say one thing that maybe we kind of forgot, which is that in June of 2023, that feels like a decade ago, the judges in the Netanyahu trial actually said to the prosecution and the defense, they met with them privately, and they said to the prosecutors that the bribery charge against Netanyahu will be difficult to prove. Now, why is this important? First of all, because it is the most severe charge against Netanyahu, but it means that the case against him is still pretty strong in the indictment, but it has become a little less strong. At the end of the day, the person who will decide to take this plea bargain and say, okay, I am leaving political life, will be Netanyahu himself. It doesn't seem at the moment that we are in right now that is something likely to happen.
Yeah, so not one to hold your breath. I think this is one of these things that in the end is going to have to be solved politically rather than judicially, as it were. It reminds me a little bit of those perennial conversations about Donald Trump and what legal mechanisms were there to somehow get this guy out of public life. And in the end, it's politics, and politics is probably going to be the way.
So this really leads us to our next question that also has to do with the Israeli Prime Minister.
Hi, Jonathan and Yonit. I love the podcast. A couple of weeks ago, when you were hosting Ezra Klein, he was talking about the Democratic Party failing to make a case for themselves and convince people that their candidate is good, and instead just making an effort to make a case against Trump. And he was joking about Bibi in the same way. And I wanted to ask if you can talk more about your thoughts, if the Israeli left is sort of the same in that way and only trying to fight Bibi instead of putting up better candidates.
I mean, it's funny. I a few years ago, I think it was about 8 years ago, I interviewed Ayelet Shaked, who was then the Justice Minister for The Atlantic. And the title was The Woman Who Would Be the Next Prime Minister. So we all make mistakes in political analysis, definitely in Israel. But she said something to me that I've sort of held since. And she said, Netanyahu is the most determined person in the political arena to be the prime minister. I think that was true then, and in a way, it's still true now. In the sense just of politics, no one is better than him in understanding that sort of mixture, particularly in identity politics, bringing together the different groups, the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists, and the people who think they have been discriminated or let down by the system, right? Netanyahu manages somehow to be a victim of the system, even though the victim of the elites, even though he's been prime minister for 16 years. So he's very good at politics. I think it's going to be very hard for the left in this country to find someone who can match him in that regard. I think I've spoken to so many people in the United States asking me, why doesn't Benny Gantz do this or why doesn't he do that? And the immediate answer is that he is not as sophisticated in politics as Netanyahu is, and there aren't many in the political arena in Israel or honestly in other places. I would say, and I've been saying this a lot to you, I think that the place to look for an alternative is also on the right, someone who will challenge him. And we saw this with Naftali Bennett in 2021 and 2022, managing to become prime minister with his coalition. And I think that might be key for a challenge in the next election, whenever that might be.
Now, it may be because Elad, in his question, mentioned Ezra Klein, but the way I immediately read this was because I have picked this up from others as well, which is I think it's a kind of transference from what people have seen in the United States, which is here was the country in this apparent sort of gridlock or stalemate in the Biden-Trump contest, which appeared to be that was all heading one way, which was the return of Donald Trump. And then suddenly, just a couple of moves, one move really, Joe Biden announces he's not going to run again, and suddenly everything changes and it unlocks all this new energy and all the polls change and everything changes. And Trump, the big bad wolf in a way of American politics, suddenly appears to be on a downward trajectory. That might change, by the way, but right now it looks like that. And so I wonder if partly what's driving this is a thing which says, if Netanyahu is, similarly just there forever, is there another equally quick fix that could dramatically change the game? And so because American politics is in my mind, it then made me think, if Israel were American politics, the person everyone would be saying has got the absolute dream resume, who is obviously the person everyone's going to get excited about, and I'll say it so that you don't even have to, and this is absolutely not what is happening or the reality in Israel, but they would be freaking out, killing themselves about Yair Golan. They'd be saying, what? There is a political leader who was a literal hero on October the 7th. Are you joking? This guy actually himself grabbed his gun, put on his uniform, and saved lives. He's obviously the candidate and obviously the next leader of the country. It's as if there was a mainstream politician who personally had gone into the Twin Towers on 9/11 and come out with rescuing people who was now seeking the presidency. Obviously, that person is going to be a huge success, you would think. In America, they were going mad about Mark Kelly because he's an astronaut. Here's Israel, who's got a bona fide, credentialed, senior military commander with big experience, who was a hands-on hero, lifesaver on October the 7th. And yet look at the polls. He's, on the margins. He's leader now of the Israeli Labour Party. Labour might do quite well, meaning instead of being, projected not even to make it into the Knesset, now they should. And if they merge with Meretz in a smooth way, they could maybe get 6 or 7 seats in a 120-seat parliament. This is not a person people are predicting to storm in as the new prime minister. It just shows, I say it as an illustration of just how particular the politics of Israel are, that the same rules do not apply. Yair Golan, I've seen him and I've interviewed him. He's a charismatic figure. There's no reason why somebody like him shouldn't be plausible. As you say, it's not even being talked about as anybody from that cab. On the contrary, it will be somebody else, a kind of a rightist who doesn't carry Bibi's personal baggage, who is the person to look for. I'm sure that's correct, but it just shows you how very different it is. Because if Yair Golan was running for president of the United States, he would have all the buzz and all the excitement. His misfortune is that he's in Israel and he's up against a sort of master political player in the form of Benjamin Netanyahu.
There's a lot to unpack there, but obviously it's pretty true that in the American system, it's pretty much half and half, left and right? I mean, things have been different since Trump is on the scene, but generally that is the situation. Now, it's hard to expect from anyone, even if he's Superman, to take the Labour Party from the crash situation that it is in to, okay, let's see if they can have, 30 seats in the Knesset. That is a difficult thing to pull for anyone. And in the situation that the Israeli left is in, and by the way, also after what happened on October 7th, right? And if you have... The difference between the left and right, in a sense, in this country is that the left have always had this plan. The plan was a Palestinian state. Let's give them a state. Let's go on with our lives, separation, etc. Now, what you're saying to Israelis who have seen what happens when Hamas terrorists have their own land, that equals they build a terror infrastructure and attack Israel, that becomes an even harder sell. So I agree that on paper, you can say, listen, he has, as you said, a dream resume. It's a very difficult thing to translate into the Israeli political system.
Yeah, no, 100%. Don't worry. I wasn't, otherwise you would want to know what I was smoking. I wasn't in any way suggesting that Yair Golan was the man to watch as the next prime minister. I was saying that a resume like his in another context would be a fast track ticket to the top. And also, you're right, it's October the 7th makes people say, well, look, this obviously didn't work. The only person who could possibly challenge that on a Nixon to China level would be a hero of October 7th. Because he could say, no one needs to lecture me on what happened on October 7th. I was right there. Nevertheless, I still think our only hope is to pursue two states and so on.
And by the way, I mean, when you look at the American system, what is interesting is up until Kamala Harris, many people were saying, wait a minute, this huge country with all of its rich resources and human resources could only supply two people for the presidency, both of them either close to 80 or over 80, right? And in Israel, I would just say there is a richness of human resources. There are a lot of people to look at on the left and on the right and in the center that are promising politicians. So it's not that there's not something to look at. And by the way, as elections will approach, there will be a shift in the way that we see. There are a lot of people who have become heroes of this past year and a half that I think might enter politics. It's not that, if you're a left-wing voter, you should despair. I'm just saying this is going to be such a fundamental shift in Israeli society to suddenly perhaps not have Netanyahu as part of the game, that you might have to go through several stages until you see a different political vision here.
I think that's so right. But Netanyahu has been one of those tall trees in whose shade nothing can grow. Mm-hmm. When you have someone who's prime minister for 15 years, that happens. The other thing I would also say is that somebody who has been so determined to control so much of the country, we know that how determined he is, for example, to influence the media, and he has cheerleaders there in Channel 14. It's not unlike a kind of, I think this is his project, by the way, the sort of, if you were asking how come there are not lots of leaders in Hungary to challenge Viktor Orban, that's because he's been so dominant, and that's not by accident. He has ensured his dominance, and in that climate, rivals and alternatives do not flourish. And that is the situation, I would say, in Orban's Hungary, but in a way, in Netanyahu's Israel too. He has not allowed a whole lot of other centers of power to emerge. Let's take another question, and this one comes from Daniel.
Do you not think that your use of the term chutzpah in Chutzpah Award is somewhat incorrect? It's usually a term of endearment. He had the chutzpah to start a manufacturing business with his national service earnings or something, whereas you're referring to some pretty bad people. Just a thought.
I have to say, I completely love this question.
I was going to say, this is a question for you, Jonathan.
I love
you
this.
Take it from here.
I do love this question because it's about words, obviously, but also it's a little bit about us because we did get into this in a past episode. Do go back to our episode with Malcolm Gladwell, I think in November 2022, I think. And he had made a whole podcast about the meaning of the word chutzpah, and that was one of the things we wanted to talk about with him. The reason why I love it is this is such an unholy topic because it goes to a difference between Israel and diaspora on one level, but really it's Israel and American Jewry, I think. It's not, because I think the rest of the diaspora have an Israeli understanding of this word. So what's the distinction I'm drawing here? In America, it's quite true that, as Daniel suggests, the word implies sort of brio and, courage and moxie to use that American word, that there's a sense that the person is plucky and courageous in a way you would admire. They had the chutzpah to build up this whole business from scratch. We admire them. In Israel, and I would say everywhere else in the Jewish world, chutzpah is outrageous behavior. It's rude and it has cheek to it, that someone has the nerve to do something. The classic definition that's offered for the term is the person who comes before the judge accused of murdering his two parents and pleads for leniency because he is an orphan. That's chutzpah. It isn't that you built up a great startup tech company. Chutzpah is that you did something outrageous. So the reason why we give chutzpah of the week each week to some appalling politician or some terrible social media person is because they've done something awful, rather than because otherwise we'd be handing it out to end entrepreneurs or whatever each week. So it comes to a cultural difference. Americans took this word and decided to make it something plucky and innovative, and it was at odds with the Yiddish understanding of the word, I think, which Israel lives with, which is, no, it's a negative. It's somebody has done something which is unforgivably rude and outrageous.
What I like about this so much is that we're starting our own spin-off podcast. We're going to call it Chutzpod, and it's going to be Jonathan explaining every week the different varied meanings of the word chutzpah. This is just, it's fascinating stuff. I want to keep on listening to you talking about what chutzpah is. But it's exactly right. There is a difference here between the two kind of chutzpahs. By the way, if you listen back to that Malcolm Gladwell episode, what you're listening to is, I think, about 5 minutes of different ways to also pronounce the word chutzpah, which is also different.
Because you would say chutzpah.
Right, in Hebrew. So that is also something that you should go back to that episode and listen to. We're not going to do that again, but I think that is exactly the distinction. That is why we give the chutzpah award. By the way, in our original pilot, we can remind our listeners again, in our original pilot, we only had a chutzpah award. And then our friend Iska Kornfeld called us up and said, no, you have to have something that is a little bit optimistic and a little nicer at the end of the program. So give out a Mensch award. And currently we are considering the Michigan award as well, but that is for future episodes.
Yeah, and plenty of material for all of those.
That's true. That will never be lacking.
So we thank Iska for the brilliant innovation. That was almost chutzpah in an American sense there, a bit of innovation from her. And we also thank Daniel for his brilliant question, which I truly loved. Next up, Elan Panov from Toronto in Canada.
My name is Elan Panov. I have been listening to your show each week since October 7, and it has truly been a lifeline for me in these dark times. Part of what has made the last 10 months so challenging for me is a sense of helplessness to influence what is happening. As journalists, you are at the forefront of reporting on troubling events that seem to occur almost daily now, and you interview amazing people who analyze them 100 different ways. Yet the gap between understanding what is happening and being able to act on that knowledge seems insurmountably wide. So my question, which I hope is not too personal, is this: do you ever feel a sense of helplessness in these tumultuous times? And, if so, what are some ways you overcome that?
And Laura from New York asked us something similar. Let's hear that too.
My name is Laura from New York, longtime listener, first-time caller. And my question is, I guess, just how are you doing? Every Jew I know is currently going through it and has been going through it for the past over 10 months now. How are you guys holding up? Are you reading anything non-war that's good? Are you watching any good non-war shows, non-war hobbies?
Those are two heartwarming questions. And there hasn't been a lot of time over these 10 months to kind of ask how we're doing. So thank you for asking. Obviously, I'm not doing great. Neither is the rest of my country. And it's interesting to me that when this all started, a lot of people would come up to me and ask, like, what should we do? Like, what are we supposed to do? And I said, do 3 things. I hope my boss isn't listening to this episode. I said, stop watching the news, get out of the house and help someone. Find someone you can help and do that. That will help with your anxiety and with your feeling of helplessness. It will just, you'll actually be doing something. But obviously the length of this that we kind of didn't expect means that we need to sort of recalibrate everything, because the amount of energy all of us, put into just acting like everything is normal when nothing is, puts a lot of strain on everyone, really. The only difference I think that sort of journalists have in this world, in this position, and we've talked about this a lot, you and I, when I look at the past 10 months, there are things I saw that I wish I could unsee, and there are things I've heard that I wish I could unhear, and there are things I know I wish I didn't. And there's no way to kind of deal with that besides saying, you know, this is my job, this is what I'm doing on, this is what I'm focused, and to know that the element of bringing information to the public has a layer that was always there, but is much more, is underscored and is a more dramatic effect, is in reassuring the public, which I think is important, not only in general in the mood. I wouldn't say it's the thing that is in our job description, but has become in our job description. So I don't know if that's a long, convoluted answer to that question. I'm not sure I answered the question, how are you doing? But that is what I can answer it at this point.
No, I think that will be helpful for people to hear what you just said. I think that's a very extra thing on you. This thing, when you said your job, I think you mean it's not collective. It's just you, that's very particularly on you. This thing of reassuring the public. I've said it before on the podcast. So it's not new, but I think it's an extra weight that sits on your shoulders. It's quite unusual. Many journalists, we sort of stand outside it, but because of your very particular position as the anchor of the most watched TV news broadcast, you're the person people look to for reassurance, and I think that is a great weight on your shoulders. You didn't answer Laura's point about hobbies, though, Yonit, and the listener already knows that you like sitting fully clothed by swimming pools, using your laptop. But we need to have a hobby at least for you to mention to us, or even just something you do in your downtime.
You know, it's interesting because I had this moment a few months ago that I walked into a bookstore and I found myself tearing up because I had realized that it has been so long. I know this won't surprise our longtime listeners. I love reading books more than probably anything in the world. And I'd realized how long it has been since I actually read a book, because the survival mode was such that can't allow yourself to actually do that. So I guess the answer is, you know, very boringly, reading books and watching silly television. That is the thing that I've found myself managing to do in these past couple of months.
Any
very
recommendations?
Uninteresting. I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
I should get a surfboard and do something really interesting.
No, I'm with you on I'm with you on distracting television. Slow Horses is my latest thing. Have you anything to recommend to Laura?
Not bad. Oh, I was going to think more in the book department than in the. Is that okay?
Yeah.
No, the recent thing I've been reading is Honeybees and Distant Thunder. I don't know why I've been finding myself gravitating towards books about music, but that is the recent one, and it's wonderful. But really, anything that you could do to kind of distract your mind for a little while is good.
No, I agree. So I was going to pick up your first point and your bit of advice, which I think is useful, which is less news, and very particularly, I would say, social media and doom scrolling. I really would advise people to not do that. And I sometimes give this advice to members of my own family who will then see me consuming lots of news and say, oh, you're a real hypocrite. You're doing exactly what you're telling us not to do. And here's the difference, I think, which is, a lot of people said to me when I was writing the last book I wrote, The Escape Artist, which was, as you know, a man who escaped from Auschwitz. There was a lot of very difficult stuff in there that I had to read through, and obviously what I included in the book was just a fraction of everything I'd read. And people said, how did you manage that? In a way, the question was very similar to the two questions we've just had about how did you cope with that? And I said at first this answer, which was quite sort of glib, but later on I realized there was some meaning to it, which is I said, I think it's easier to write this stuff than to read it, I said. Meaning it was harder for you as a reader than it was for me. And the reason why there was some sense in that is I think what you and I have both in common, because it's striking that these listeners very caringly worry about us and how we're managing. But there's something in our job that means we get to metabolize and sort of process all this stuff because you do it on the news, I do it in a newspaper column, and then we do it together on Unholy. And the stuff comes in, but it then does not all of it, but some of it comes out. And that means we're not carrying around all of it. Whereas I think for people who are just sitting at home, and perhaps especially for people outside Israel who are just absorbing this stuff and and scrolling after one awful tweet after another, and then it just sort of sits in them, I think that's very difficult. I think that's asking yourself to take on too much. It's different if you, as a working journalist, you have an outlet. And if you don't have that outlet, I don't think it's a great idea to take on too much of it. If anything, I would say make your consumption one podcast a week, namely Unholy, and then talk about it with your family, and then that can be plenty. I don't think you have to sort of feel you've got to know every single thing minute by minute. And yeah, I'm with you on escapism. The odd thing is, journalistically, that's happened is I have found, American politics is a version of escapism compared to this story and the Middle East, and just getting myself, immersed in the latest polling out of, Nebraska's congressional district of Omaha, which actually has a separate electoral college vote. We are both nerdy, you and me, but that is just a diversion from, life and death and blood and suffering in the Middle East. And yes, and TV, Slow Horses is my latest one. Fleischman's in Trouble, I would also recommend. Things like that just divert you from all of it.
We're both nerdy, but there are different shades, because I don't know if our listeners noticed, I assume they did, that when I talked about hobbies, I said reading books. When you talked about hobbies, you said writing books. Essentially, that is the answer that you gave. But I would also add that to me, and again, not to be too, emotional about this, I think that this podcast has helped me, and just in the way that I knew that I had a weekly conversation with you where I had to make sense of things. And obviously a day-to-day newscast means that you have to do that, but it's a different kind of making sense. And I think that having to explain even to you, not only to our listeners, like what I have been going through this week, made it, somehow organized my thoughts. The final thing I would say about this to anyone having a hard time, and I know that a lot of our listeners have during this year, go easy on yourself. This is a very, very, very difficult time. Don't add self-flagellation to the list of things that you're doing as a hobby. Please just go easier on yourself, if that makes any sense. So
I think we thank all those who wrote in with some fantastic questions. You've heard over this week and last week some of them. There were lots and lots that we couldn't get to. We plan to do this more often, and we will. But for now, we say continue spreading the word across all these different places. You can do that on Instagram and on Facebook at 2 Jews on the News, 2 with a figure 2. And there's a whole lot of other ways to get in touch with us, which you will see in the show notes. They're all there in the episode description.
Right. And we will say our big thank yous to Omer Primat and Michal Porat, and we shall meet next week.